Good evening. On behalf of the FLENJ board, I would like to welcome you to FLENJ's fourth web chat for educators for the 2018-2019 school year. This evening's web chat is entitled Target Language Use and Authenticity of Interactions. My name is Dana Pilla, and I will be facilitating this evening's web chat. Our web chat series is a professional development offering to the world language education community. FLENJ's webinars are designed to bring important ideas and conversations to our members through the experts on our board and in our field. Please note that the audio and video of this webinar will be recorded. I'll provide you with details about how you can access the on-demand recording at the end of the web chat. This webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour and will be run more like an informal discussion among the participants and facilitators. If you'd like to ask a question of the presenter during the webinar, feel free to use the audio feature, or if you feel more comfortable, the chat feature on the sidebar. The presenter or facilitator will address your questions as you ask them. Take advantage of this opportunity to dialogue directly with experts in the field. As a registered live participant, you are eligible to receive a certificate of attendance stating that you signed up for and logged into this webinar. Details on how to receive this will be shared at the end of the webinar. FLENJ cannot guarantee any professional development credit for this webinar. For those watching this video on demand at a later date, FLENJ is unable to grant a certificate of attendance. All participants are encouraged to work with their immediate supervisor to determine how best to receive credit for this professional development. In the event of technical difficulties, please remain connected to the webinar as you are able. FLENJ will contact you directly if the problem cannot be resolved. You may also email us at dpilla@flenj.org, but please understand that it is sometimes not possible to check email and run the webinar simultaneously. Thank you for your time and attention to these messages. And now, please let me take this opportunity to introduce you to our presenter, Nathan Lutz. Nathan is the Global Learning Coordinator and primary school French teacher at Kent Place School, a national leader in independent girls' schools, located in Summit, New Jersey. Nathan is also the National World Language Teaching Community Coach for Teach for America. In addition to his service to foreign language educators of New Jersey as Vice President of Programs, Nathan is also the immediate past president of the National Network for Early Language Learning and a 2020 chair of the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. Nathan is a frequent conference presenter, as well as a consultant for school districts and a writer and editor for various early language programs. Follow Nathan on Twitter at Nathan Lutz. Nathan, thank you for presenting today. I'm going to switch to your screen.
Hey, Dana.
Hey.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Now, we're switching to your screen, Nathan. Hopefully it's going to work. Why don't I see it? There we go.
It looks like it is.
All right.
Yay.
So we'll just run this like a little conversation between me and you, Nathan.
All right. Very good. So this is a really important topic, I think, for us in the field of world languages, is the whole idea both of target language use, but also of authenticity of interactions. We talk a lot about using authentic resources, but I think it's very important for us to also consider that our learners are sometimes in our classroom because they have a world language credit that they have to achieve, but also they want to learn how to interact in the target language in an authentic way and to speak with people in authentic settings. And nobody ever says, I want to be able to conjugate all the Spanish verbs and all the tenses. They say, I want to be able to speak Spanish with people. So I think that's really an important goal for us as teachers. Whoops, for some reason I'm not advancing forward. I just wanted to let people know that they can feel free to reach out to me after the fact. I've got my email at the end of this, but you can also tweet at me too. I'm happy to dialogue with people after the fact. I'm the Boy Scout of world languages, what can I say?
Yes, you are.
I also set up a website which has a blog, but I also have resources from many of my workshops and webinars, and tonight's session, the slide deck at least is on the website, nathanlutz.org, so people can check that out as they wish. Here's other fun ways to connect with me: Pinterest, Instagram, etc. So I just want to briefly go over our agenda for this evening. I'm going to talk with Dana about target language, talk about interaction and communication, also authenticity, and then task tonight's attendees with the, something to work on and something to reflect on to guide them in their planning and execution of lessons throughout the remainder of the year and for years to come. All right, let's start off talking about target language. It's a really big topic in our field, and I wanted to share this position statement that ACTFL puts out with a little emphasis that I've added. The research indicates that effective language instruction must provide significant levels of meaningful communication and interactive feedback in the target language in order for students to develop language and cultural proficiency. Notice that I put significant levels of meaningful communication. This is the whole idea of the authenticity of interactions. There can be a lot of different language that is thrown at our students or that our students are being immersed in, but if it's not meaningful, then it really is a wasted opportunity on them, and most likely not something that they're going to be able to acquire. So, as much as we say that 90% of classroom time and classroom activities need to be used in the target language, that whole idea of that meaningful communication is really critical for us.
And Nathan, for people listening, in your opinion, what exactly does that mean? Because that's a really broad statement, and I think it's something we all understand, those of us that have been teaching a long time, but for new educators in the foreign language classroom, what does meaningful mean to you?
So that's a very good question. So for me, and I think it really depends on your audience. I have taught all levels from preschool all the way through college, and it looks different for the different levels. The kids that I have now in an elementary school, meaningful for them needs to have something of bearing upon their life and on their existence. So a good example of that is talking about grammar. I don't think that's very interesting for any learner, no matter what the age, but having a real purpose for them is really important. An example that I often will make fun of, back when I taught high school, there was a whole unit in the French 2 textbook on going to the post office. And I used to laugh at that because I thought, what 16-year-old goes to a post office? And this was back in the days of pre-email. Even in the snail mail days, 16-year-olds didn't go to the post office. And nowadays, probably not at all. So I just thought like that was such a, that I had to teach such a unit that took up so much time of our year and took up so much space in the textbook was really ludicrous, because it just I felt like there were so many better things that we could have been doing with our time other than talking about
the post office. Just like that brings to mind my most unfavorite unit, the airport. And we just, every school I was in, it had to be a unit, and I said, you don't even need Spanish in an airport, really. I mean, everything is in English. And besides the fact, what are we doing in an airport in Spanish, really? That always just killed me. Every time I had to teach that, I used to make it shorter and shorter every year. But certainly the age, it does change with age, what is meaningful. When I teach, now that I'm teaching at the university level, and I teach students going in the medical field, they really like to talk about diseases and how diseases progress in Spanish, and proper nutrition and how to counsel a patient in nutrition. So that might not appeal to a kid that's 15, but that could appeal to a young adult that's 21 that wants to be a nurse. So
exactly,
it's knowing your audience, just like you said.
Right on. So I think it's really, that's crucial to the way that we should be designing our curriculum with our students. So we hear target language a lot, and I want to drive home that it's more than just us talking 90% plus of the time in the target language, but that we have to have some thinking about it. And that involves the different strategies that we need to use as teachers in order to make comprehension happen for our students and to help support meaning making. And an example that I give to people a lot is that when I lived in France, I lived with a host family, and when their phone would ring, I needed to answer the phone because it might have been the family calling. And whenever it was somebody other than the family calling, I would always go into a panic because I felt like I needed to take down a message. I had to write down a phone number, and I was always afraid I was going to get the phone number wrong because I'd have to ask a million times for them to repeat. And just that whole barrage of words into the phone was really challenging for me as a person. And I needed those scaffolds and you know, maybe that live interaction with the sympathetic listener where the person could see the utter confusion on my face by not being able to hear them.
That's so funny. I had to do the same thing in Spain when I went when I was 16. I used to answer the phone. It was just like the most anxiety-ridden real life task I could ever imagine.
Exactly. Now everyone has cell phones and their own personal phones, so
Yeah.
no random people would be calling me. But this whole idea of target language, you know, we hear, you know, we've got to be in the language 90% of the time, but I want the attendees to look at these two pictures and really think about this whole water metaphor as language. Like, is the language that we're providing for our students like the picture on the left, where the dog is just being flooded with water in a very unpleasant looking way? Or if you look on the right, where you see that the water is being given to the dog in a way that's accessible and in a sort of gentle and supported way. And it looks like I would like to be the dog on the right, like having the nice gentle stream of water instead of being flooded. And I think language works in the same way, that if you're barraging people, like the phone example that both of us just, you know, talked about suffering from, or being in a situation where the interaction is going to be a lot more gentle and a lot, you know, with some scaffolding involved. And, you know, it makes me think of an example when I was visiting in France. I did this was my trick, and also in when I visited Spain a couple of years ago, I would always ask for directions from little old ladies, because I always felt like those were the nicest people, that were like the most patient and most understanding. And they typically did not know the answer, but they were my go-to people.
But they were so nice about it.
They were very nice about it, yes. But the whole idea here is that maximizing target language use is a necessary thing, but it's not sufficient unto itself, meaning that if we spend 99% of the class time using the target language, that's not enough for our students to be able to acquire the language, because we have to use that language in a way that is accompanied by strategies that help facilitate comprehension and meaning making. And so this next little section, we're going to talk about ways that we can do that to help students. And one suggestion that I give a lot of different teachers is that if you look at if you're used to just teaching one level, I think you get sort of, there's a disservice to yourself in that way. Like, I have taught a lot of different levels, so I know how novice level learners work, I know how advanced level learners work, but even different ages of learners has been very helpful for me, because I think if you can teach a kindergartner, you can teach anybody. That you've learned how to pair, or, you know, think of if you have children of your own, if you know how to pare something down to its very essential thing, like giving directions or explaining a complex you know, idea to those younger people, that it helps you be able to explain or, you know, direct to anybody. And and the strategies for making target language accessible are among that. And all learners don't learn or acquire language in the same way. That what works for student A might not work for student B, and so it's helpful for us to use a variety of strategies so that you're appealing to the broadest swath of students as possible. So the first strategy that I'd like to bring up is providing comprehensible input that is directed toward communicative goals. And what I mean by that is that what we're doing is supporting what we're aiming to do, that it's not this random, information or, things that we're doing for our students that aren't in service to what we're learning about right now or the goals that I have for my students. So it's important that we stay focused and that we're always reaching toward those communicative goals that we've got. The next thing, and this is super, super important in the elementary classroom, but also for any novice level learners, is that we make meaning clear through our body language or through gestures and visual support. I myself am a visual learner, and that helps me keep myself organized and to understand things and to learn. And so I'm really acutely aware of that and make sure that I have a ton of visual support for my students. And I've got some pictures of some examples to show in just a bit. Conducting comprehension checks to ensure understanding is really an essential practice that often gets bypassed by a lot of teachers because they feel that there isn't time for this, but it's really an important formative assessment that helps us drive instruction. That if I know that my students aren't getting this part that I'm doing right here, then I can't go on to the next part because that next part is contingent upon what we just learned right before it. So I need, as a teacher, to be secure to know that my students have gotten what they needed to do, because language, as we know, is constructive. It's a building block that what they learn in one part helps them learn the next part. Negotiating meaning with students and helping negotiation among students. This is critical for our students as they are working with the interpersonal mode of communication, which we know is spontaneous, and that what one person says could change the next utterance from the other person with whom they're speaking. So it's important for them to be able to sort of work back and forth with each other, but also to learn how to ask clarifying questions or to help affirm or negate what another person is saying as well.
Nathan, can you give us an example of how you encourage students to negotiate meaning in
Sure.
class so that it's
So
not like flat out memorized language, to kind of bridge that gap between, novice, mid, and novice high, where you want the students to actually create more meaning and not just use memorized language?
sure. So one thing that I use in my classroom are language ladders for doing this. I've got an example of this in a minute, but it's something that is posted in the classroom. And it's also something that I model all the time with them. So they'll say something to me and I will, playing stupid sometimes, I'll say, what did you mean by that? Or can you say that again? Or can you please repeat that? I am, losing my hearing, I feel sometimes. So I'm not being completely disingenuous by asking them to repeat or to say something again. But I think that it's the language that we provide our students is really, really important for them in their acquisition process. And so I think what we want them to do, we need to model for them. So, and I think it's good for us as the teacher not to be the sage on the stage, but to show that we're human too, that we don't always understand, that we don't hear well, and that we need them to repeat. It may not always be the most you know, genuine of statements, but it helps provide them with language that they can use later on over time. All right. Another strategy is to elicit talk that increases in fluency, accuracy, and complexity over time. And what I mean by this is like that we're not just simply staying in the realm of either or yes, no questions, or even questions that could be answered in, with one word. But and really, if you think about the who and the what questions, those are really sort of low hanging fruit types of utterances. But if we can think of ways that we can get our students to explain or to answer why or to answer how, those are the ways that we can get them to really beef up their language and to push them along that proficiency continuum, because they're having to speak more with more detail. And just the sort of follow-up questions too. My students often make fun of me because I'm not happy with just one answer, but I'll probe. I'll do the Katie Couric and just keep asking questions to get them to
Katie Couric
to keep going. But I think it's good for them to not exist in the realm of the expected, and that class is this super scripted thing, but that we keep them on their toes a little bit and keep them thinking and keep them going. All right, the next strategy is to encourage self-expression and spontaneous use of language. This sort of goes back to that whole interpersonal thing again, where we want them to be able to speak on the fly and to speak with some level of spontaneity and to be able to express themselves in a way that they're really expressing their self-interest and things that are pertinent and relevant to themselves. And one way that we do that is we, as the teacher, model that for them. And so sometimes I will do the strategy that is called think aloud, where I'll say something like, oh, look, my pencil is dull. What do I need to do? I need to go sharpen it. I'm going to walk over to the pencil sharpener. I'm going to stick the pencil in, and I'm going to sharpen the pencil. And so even though no sane person would do this in real life, hopefully, it helps show them this sort of process and gives them language that's, it's simple. It's all sort of present tense stuff that's supported by the gestures and by the prop of the pencil and the pencil sharpener and me walking over to the pencil sharpener. But it shows them real language in use. Again, perhaps not the most authentic language because people don't narrate their actions, but it gives them some real language to work.
But it's also funny, and I think like sometimes you need those breaks. Like I remember I used to do something like that similar just to make myself crack up. I'd like the clown in the class, I'd pretend I didn't know where he was. I'd be like, where is Juanito? Does anyone see him? Is he in the
Yes.
back? Is he in the front? And the kids are like, what are you talking about? And you act it out, but at least you're having fun with it and you're doing it in the language and you're using prepositions and question words. I think doing that kind of language, even though it's kind of scripted, it's something that you do when you're raising your own children, in a foreign language. Like you repeat things, you model behaviors for toddlers. So even though we're teaching children that are older, they still need to hear that kind of exaggerated language in class.
Exactly. All right, our next strategy is to teach students strategies for requesting clarification and assistance when faced with comprehension difficulties. Again, this relates to that idea of using word walls or using the language ladders, where there's this, they help us with building our interpersonal communication and get students to rely on their own skills instead of having to slip into English or say, oh, how do you say blah, blah, blah in French, or, but that they are using real language and not having to always look for some sort of an English translation to help them along with their conversation. And then, offering feedback is really important. And that's one thing, again, that I feel a lot of teachers sometimes overlook because there is this whole rush for time, or that it's not the right time. But I think error correction is such an important, and by feedback, I don't mean just error correction, but I think error correction and feedback go hand in hand, and that the way that we help students with correction is really important. And that could be a whole other workshop or webinar, because it's proven with data, like how different types of corrections work or don't work with students. And so we need to be mindful about the types that we use with our students, and the types that we should avoid. And often we use the techniques that we were exposed to as we were language learners, and they may not be the most effective. But giving that feedback helps our students in improving their language and to interact orally in the target language. And sometimes I have students help me learn Chinese, or other languages that they might know as a home language, and I always laugh because they're always like the biggest sticklers on pronunciation, and they just halt my desire to keep up with it, because I'll mispronounce something 8 different ways, and it's doesn't even have that many syllables in the utterance that I'm trying to say. So I really like this idea that we acquire language in only one way, when we understand the messages. So it's really, really, crucially important that we help our students have full understanding of the language that's being used in class, so that they're able to acquire that language, that they're not just memorizing something to spit it out on a test, but that they're actually internalizing that language and able to use that consistently over time in real world settings. And it's that when we understand what we hear or what we read, that is truly when we understand the message. And I think this is such a powerful thought that we have to really stop and think about that. And when kids aren't getting it, then that's when we need to take the step back and say, okay, what do I need to do in order to make this happen? Because if it's not happening with one kid, it might be happening with a whole handful or even a whole class of students. And our job is there to help them grow in their proficiency, and we need to do what it takes to be able to get them there.
That piece is so pivotal with them understanding, because there's so many students that could just tune out when they hear the target language, and that's where there's like a breakdown in acquisition.
Exactly. And at that point, we're just wasting their time, and our time too, for that matter. It's really not moving anybody to continue in that way. So helping us with that is the way that we make language comprehensible, especially the input that we're giving our students, whether that be the language that we're providing as teachers, or language that we're providing via videos or via things that the students are reading or viewing, and if it's videos or audio recordings. So there's 3 different types. There's the sensorial way that we can help them, and think of our senses, usually with seeing things. There's paraverbals that deal with things that are working with language, and we have a summary there. And then we have the nonverbal things, and those are like the TPR, the gestures and facial expressions and such. I'm going to show you some of my favorites, and you'll notice that a lot of them are very visual. I don't have facial expressions of me on here yet, but perhaps. That's something to consider. All right, so word walls. This lovely black and white one is one of mine from the beginning of the school year. The trick with that, though, is I teach 8 different levels, and so I have to choose which classes or which major words we're going to focus on um, for the students. But these are really a staple of elementary classrooms in just the first language for students. But they can be very helpful for students, of course, in the second language, because they often need reminders of what a word is or how to spell something. And so if it's there on the wall for them, it's so helpful. I love checking out other people's classrooms. I think it's such a joy to pop into them, and it's always so interesting because I notice that high school teachers, no offense, often are the worst at using or maximizing the room as a resource for their students. That you'll often see blank walls, or maybe a blank wall with like a little fancy poster in the middle of it. In my room, I've got every square inch plastered with useful stuff. And I know that that's not the luxury for a lot of teachers if you share rooms or if you push in, or in your case at the university, you are teaching in some random room
right
at every time of the day. And so I've recommended to some people to create digital word walls that could be shared on a course management system.
what we do to try to get around that, because I find the visuals to be very powerful, even when teaching really upper level subjects. I think they can't possibly acquire the vocabulary without a visual, especially in the medical field where we talk about diseases and treatments, and it's just a lot of vocabulary. We do basically, I would call it like a digital board on Google Docs, and we all collaborate to, like, for instance, take a hospital intake form, like a patient questionnaire, and we split it up into functional chunks, and students look up pictures to show what that means. So if it asks about, did you get your vaccines, then they'll put the words vacunas, and then they'll put pictures of needles under it. So I make them go and take this chart and kind of boil it down to words. And it's a good reading comprehension activity, but it also makes them a resource they can study from.
Excellent. Love it. And that was even making me think, like, you could even take those forms and annotate them too, and have little notes off onto the side where students are
making the questions up, or there's so many ways that, if you're limited, because we're going to get a lot of teachers that will watch this and say, oh, well, I'm on a cart, or I don't have my own classroom, or I share a classroom with a math teacher. It doesn't mean that you can't make something digitally that could serve its purpose in the same way that your word walls are serving its purpose in the classroom.
Exactly. Another big thing, and I just started using something like this a couple of years ago, and they have come in, like, they're just so handy, is to have question word posters in your classroom, because I feel, for me, I feel like students often struggle with acquiring these, and I think if they're right there for them, and it also helps when you're asking the question, is just go up and point to the darn poster as you're saying it, and it helps trigger for them, oh, he's asking about a place, so I need to answer with a place and not whatever else that might crop up into their minds. But for me, these are super important, and I have them right up front and center in my room so that they're always ready for me. These are not mine. They're a Spanish example, but I have them very prominently placed because they're so useful and so used in my practice. Another example, I don't use these. This is a German example, but I think it's a really cool example, is to use word mats. These might be helpful for the teacher who's on a cart. Think of it as a placemat that's sitting at the kid's spot, and it could have whatever type of language that you feel would be helpful and useful for students to use and have some, really practical information that they could refer to very quickly. Maybe for visually impaired students, ones who may not be able to see the word wall quite as easily, this might help them out. And the good thing about this too is it's easier to change out. So if you're teaching 5 different levels in your room, you can just swap out the word mats depending on what level, or maybe you have a word mat for each unit that you're teaching, or have the students help you develop these word mats and put language that they think they need help with and remembering. Another example that's often used in world language classrooms are classroom labels. You'll see on the bottom, they're all the nouns: the door, the window, the computer. One thing that I like using, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, is instead of using these labels that all deal with nouns and the objects that are in your classroom, is to post the verbiage that deals with that item. So next to my clock, I don't have the word for clock. I have quelle heure est-il? What time is it?
Oh, that's smart.
Which is, yeah. So on my window, I have what's the weather, and on the lunch calendar, I've got what's for lunch today.
Oh, I like
On
that.
the
That's a good idea.
yeah, it's a lot more useful, I think, because it's
Mhm.
the language that, yeah, yes, knowing the word for clock is useful, but I think knowing the expression what time is it is vastly more important
Right.
for our students. Um, Rejoinders, these were made by Amy Lenord from Texas, and there's a French version available. Catherine Uslan did the French translation of these. What I like about these is it groups language into the different types of rejoinder that you might have. So you've got in that yellow column all the different ways that you can agree with somebody. And there's a lot there, and that's really cool. When I've posted rejoinders before for my older students, they will actually challenge themselves to try to use like the most ludicrous sounding one or the funniest sounding one, and to really keep a variety going. So they wouldn't always, use a rejoinder that's the most simple or the most commonly used one, but they'll, to kind of up the ante and be competitive with each other, they'll use like, all of them. And so in a way, it helps them stretch beyond the more rote or the more common things, but to really keep their game up.
I like that. Keep your game up. It's good. I like
Yes.
how they're different colors too.
Yeah, I like that. It's very,
Mhm.
eye-catching for students.
Mhm.
I've mentioned language ladders a million times. These are really great. They kind of work like the rejoinders because they're categorized by the sort of type of utterance that they are. So this is, different ways that you, and this is obviously an English example, different ways that you can express confusion. You can say, I don't know, I don't understand, please repeat, etc. But that you're helping show students that language is not finite, that you don't have just one way of saying something, but that you have this multiplicity of ways of saying something depending on your mood or your, whatever. But that it helps them see that there's, more than one way to express yourself. All right, we're going to talk about interactions now. So interactions can be, there's so many different ways that we can interact, that it's not just, writing to somebody and having to read their response, but it can also be speaking to them or speaking at them. And so we have to be mindful of the different ways that we might interact depending on what the venue is. So the way I write is going to be vastly different than the way that I talk with my friend. And the way that I talk with my friend is going to be vastly different from the way that I talk to a class of students or to an auditorium full of people or on a webinar with somebody. So one thing that I'd like to think about are, we were talking about the whole post office unit. I'd like to think of some, tired classroom interactions. And you often see these as prompts on a test. So here's one. Imagine you are I'm sorry, I've got a grammar typo there. You're the valedictorian of your class in France, and you have to give a speech to your peers, their families, and friends. What would you say? Well, the thing that I always laugh about with these types of prompts is that whole imagine, like that, like you're always in this realm of imagining, but instead, like, why can't we think of like the authentic world? Like, you're a student and you know that not everybody's going to be the valedictorian of their class. um, or even worse, where you've got the, imagine you're um, a waiter in the restaurant and your customer says to you yada yada yada. Like, not everybody's going to be a waiter, and so I feel like we need to make things of relevance to the students existence at the time, and not this whole pretend world situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I, think about all the different tired interactions that you've had to deal with over the years, whether they be out of your textbook or some sort of testing protocol that you've had to do with your students. But what are, the ways that we can get around um, using these, and to help students play in the realm of their real lives, and not in this whole pretend life that they may not ever be able to imagine themselves in. Communication. So big part of tonight's talk. Sandra Savignon says that communication is the expression, interpretation, and sometimes renegotiation of meaning in a given context. What is more, communication is also purposeful. So that goes back to that whole ACTFL statement that I started off with, is that language has to be purposeful in order for communication to take place. And I'm going to break down this definition into a couple of parts because it's important for us to sort of get at it. So that definition contained the word meaning, and meaning is the information in a message. So it's sort of like the really basic, declarative, it's 2 o'clock. You can't really argue with that. There's no wiggling around that. 2 o'clock is 2 o'clock. Expression. That's the way that an entity's production during a communicative event, and it can be oral or it can be non-oral. So an example of that, I see Dana at the FLENJ conference and I say, Dana, great to see you. That's the way that I've chosen to express it, because I'm happy to see her. I'm going to exclaim it. I'm going to give her a big hug and a kiss. And it sort of, it's the way that I've chosen to express myself, and that there's emotion behind it, and that there's feeling there. Now, interpretation. That's when there's an expression of meaning that's communicative, only if someone or some other entity is expecting to understand the message or intent. So I could say, great to see you, to an empty room with no audience, and there's nothing going on there because nobody's there to hear it. It doesn't make any sense for me to do that whatsoever. And then contrast that to the previous example when I was running into Dana at the FLENJ conference and using a lot of emotion there, that there was some expression going on and true communication. Negotiation, we've brought this idea up a few times tonight, and that's sort of that whole back and forth business that's going on when communication is not successful. So, and that happens a lot, especially when you're dealing with another language. Thinking of my situation when I was in Spain, asking the little old ladies for directions, and I would say, where's the blah, 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 or how do you get to the subway? And they don't know where the subway is because they only walk. And so there's this sort of unsuccessful communication going on there. And so I could, re-explain or come up with a different target that, a different place that's maybe near the subway or whatever, in order to get, better help from this person. And she may say, oh, whatever, clarifying or trying to seek sort of clarification from what I'm trying to say. And that's under the assumption that we're both using the language correctly. Now imagine if the person's vocabulary or the grammar is a little bit off, and that there's some, true breakdown in the communication going on. So we'd really be doing a lot to seek clarification. And then context is very important, and that's the setting and the participants. And so it really depends on the who, what, where, and why, that what one person is saying greatly differs from what another person might be saying, or the place that in which they're doing it. There's all these variables that need to be brought into consideration, because what one person says could vary greatly from what another person says in a certain setting. And then finally, purpose. That's the reason for the communication. This is psychosocial, it's cognitive, and informational. That, I'm in the example of me asking the little old lady in Spain where the subway is. I have a real, purpose, and that's I need to get to the subway because I need to go somewhere. And so for me, that's the purpose. And maybe her purpose is she's nice and she wants to listen to this confused American who doesn't know where he's going. All right, authenticity. So that's a question that we've been kind of circling around, but we want to understand what makes something authentic and what makes something inauthentic. So we talked about this a little bit with the whole idea of the post office, or another example that comes to mind, I had to teach one time this whole unit on parts of a car, and I'm like,
oh my God.
These kids maybe just be learning how to drive, and I don't even know the names for all these things. And so how important is it for them to learn like the word for windshield wipers in French?
I know.
So we're going to look at 3 different types of things that we do in the classroom to help us get at the idea of authenticity: exercises, activities, and tasks. So let's look at this example, something that we see often. Restate the question using inversion. Est-ce que vous parlez espagnol? Est-ce qu'il étudie à Paris? Est-ce qu'il voyage avec des amis? So, do you speak Spanish? Does he study in Paris? And do they travel with their friends? So those are all questions that could be grammatically transformed by using inversion. All right, so this is, very common textbook type example of things that textbooks ask students to do in order to help them learn how to deal with question formation, etc. So this is a typical exercise, and with it, there's no focus on interpretation of meaning. And there's no communicative purpose because they're just doing grammatical, manipulation of the sentences. And the purpose of this thing that we've just asked them to do is to practice the language. So no communication going on. I would say Zippo in the Department of Authenticity. All right, the next example that I'd like to give: interview your partner and find out what he or she did over the weekend. How often have we seen or heard this? Million times, right?
Every Monday.
Yes.
And I remember when I taught Spanish 5, I would fall into that trap. And this one kid used to say every Monday, "Yo jugué videojuegos." I played video games. That's the only thing he said. That's all he did,
Or slept. That's another one.
That's it.
Yes.
Or he ate. Yo comí.
Exactly. So this is an example of an activity. There is no focus on interpretation of meaning, and there's no communicative purpose, even though there is this whole idea of finding out what they're doing. It really falls into this sort of rote activity, that it's just on the interpretation there.
Nathan, we have about 5 more minutes before we start to wrap it up. So I just wanted to let you know in case you have to summarize some slides.
Yes, thank you. So this last example, you're giving a list of things that somebody might do on a summer vacation, and you've got a lot of different things going on in that list. And then a second step is then to ask a classmate, what they did over the summer, giving the same types of choices. And then as a third step, you would rate yourself and then ask your partner to rate herself on how active or sedentary that those various activities were that you both looked at in the first two steps. And so that's one example. And then another example, similar idea though, is to list 10 activities you did over the weekend, interview someone in a group, and ask if they did the same activities that you did and record the exam or record the responses that they gave. And then again, you can rate you and ask your partner to rate herself on how active and sedentary those activities were. So this type of thing that you can do in class, we would classify that as a task because there is a focus on interpretation and meaning, that they were interpreting the question of things that you might have done over the summer vacation or the weekend. And there's also a communicative purpose there. And there was some complexity in what you were asking the students to do. And that I would say that there would be a lot more interest in this type of thing that the students were doing rather than the exercise or the activity that we had looked at in the earlier part of this section here. So in this last example of the two tasks, the difference is that one of them is input oriented, where we gave them that whole list of things that they needed to rank themselves on. And then the second one was more output oriented because we were asking them to generate the list of all the different things that I might have done or that the person that I would be interviewing would have done. And what's good about those input oriented tasks, there isn't any creation of language going on for them. It's all there for them. And so they're able to sort of acquire that language or get reacquainted with it if it hasn't been acquired already. And that they're engaged in interpretation, that part of communication. And then in that second example, which was more output oriented, the learners are really creating meaning with the language of their own, and they're engaged in the interpretation and expression of meaning. So with those tasks, they're all sort of in that realm of project-based learning, and they're structured, that we've given them the sort of superstructure of what they need to do and the various broken down components that they need to do in order to fulfill it. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but just think of project-based tasks, of things that we've had students do or will have students do over the course of time that they're with us. And project-based tasks are great in that there's no intent to practice language structures per se, but instead the final outcome really involves some sort of cognitive informational purpose where they are using a lot of different information and using the target language in order to achieve those purposes for us. These tasks can definitely be used as measures of proficiency, and I really like to think of using can-do statements in order to help flesh those out. And that, of course, lends us to going back to the idea of backward design, where we have to have that end goal in mind for us to be able to design what we're asking the students to do and to break it down into sort of activities and mini tasks as they're working on that. And I'm going to show you just a quick example of a third grade unit that I've got, novice mid students. The title of the unit is Getting to Know My School. And you'll see that we're definitely steeped in backward design, having essential question, what is my day like at school, and enduring understandings of school's a vibrant place with lots of activities, and there's a lot of people who make a school run smoothly. We break it down into what students are able to do with the language across the three modes: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, all written in can-do statements and child-friendly language. And then we also have a component of interculturality included. What can I do with what I know about the culture? And we break that down into three sections of investigation, reflection, and interaction of what the students are able to do with the language in the lens of the culture that they are learning about. And then in the assessment, we have that broken down into the three modes again: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, and the different types of tasks that students are able to do or should be doing. And it's sort of like a mini IPA, but in terms of, you know, what third graders can do in that realm. And so, sorry to speak very fast at the end.
You got it
Wanted to
in.
keep it on time.
Thank you, Nathan.
But I did want to open the floor if you know, you, Dana, had any questions, or if any of the attendees had any questions. And if no one wants to ask them now, they are certainly invited to email me at mleds@flenj.org to follow up later on.
Exactly. I don't see any takers. I think that was an excellent presentation, Nathan. Thank you so much for that wonderful conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this has been recorded. The recording will be made available on request within a few days. Additional details will be sent out to you and to the general FLENJ membership on how it can be accessed. For those of you attending as a registered live participant, after this webinar, we'll send you proof of attendance in the form of a certificate of completion. And may please join us for our next webinar on finishing the school year strong, fun activities to engage learners with me, Dana Pilla. Yoo-hoo! Ending the year strong. For the recorded web chats of 2018-2019 academic year, please go to FLENJ.org. They are free to watch for all members. Okay, thank you very much, Nathan. It was great talking to you tonight.
Thanks for moderating, Dana. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.